In May of 2024, Ardnahoe was the first new distillery to release whiskey from a distillery on the island of Islay since Kilchoman did it in 2009. They did so with the 5-year-old Inaugural Release, which came out to great acclaim and was really beloved by many, setting the bar extremely high for a distillery that already had quite a bit of hype going for it. It followed that up in September with the first entry into their core range, the Infinite Loch, which has received maybe some more mixed reviews up to this point. But the question really is whether Ardnahoe is a victim of its own success already. And for me, the question is, where does this land in the pantheon of staple Islay heavily peated whiskeys like Ardbeg, Lafroig, Lagavulin, etc., etc.? Hello, everyone. Welcome to Whiskey Uncorked. I am Brian, and we are back with another Islay whiskey review. This will be the third in kind of a bit of a series over the last month or so of new whiskeys coming from the island of Islay, heavily peated whiskeys coming from the island of Islay. And we're going to be transitioning probably after this review to some other places around Scotland. But this was one I was really looking forward to talking about, being that Ardnahoe is it's exciting. It's a new Islay distillery. There's no getting around that one way or the other, provided that you like a little bit of peat in your whiskey. Anytime a new whiskey is going to come out of Islay, it's not going to happen many times. There are some more that are going to be coming out in the future. There's not going to be quite as big of a gap between Kilchoman and Ardnahoe, but we need to take advantage of these situations when they arise. So curiously, neither I believe a 70,000 bottle in 5-year-old Inaugural Release came to the U.S., at least not in any great number. And this one hasn't made it over here either. I assume at some point we will see some Ardnahoe landing here in the U.S. It's not a tiny distillery. It's a 1 million liter per year distillery. It uses worm tubs, the whole thing. Very exciting for many people. There's been some big names kind of involved at various points in Ardnahoe startup to kind of set it down in the right direction. Jim McEwen being one of them. And expectations are high, and they were high for me. I'm looking forward to it. I'm not the biggest fan or proponent of like super young Scotch whiskey. Not that I don't enjoy them, not that I don't find them to be interesting and exciting examples of where a distillery may be headed, but I haven't quite jumped into the camp of like I would be happy drinking kind of 4 or 5-year-old Scotch whiskey for the rest of my life. I haven't quite gotten there yet. I do like a little bit of maturity still on my whiskeys. Usually around like 8 years old is kind of when I feel like the climb up the hill is getting a lot easier. At least there's been some absolutely fantastic 8-year-old whiskeys I've had, for that matter. 7, 8 years old, somewhere in there. But like the 3, 4, 5-year-old stuff has been kind of on my periphery for the most part. So my expectations for this one were more of this is going to be a fun, interesting example rather than I'm really going to demand a ton from this bottle. And given that at least for me, this wasn't that expensive of a bottle, given that this was part of the free shipping promotion that I got at the end of last year from Royal Mile. So this normally comes in at 55 pounds, which will round out to about $70. That would include tax. There's no way, I don't think that we're going to get this at $64.99 plus tax. It would be great, given that even like Ardnamarkin's AD is, I think that's like $59.99 by me. It's almost certainly going to be $70 plus tax, or probably more likely $80 plus tax. But we'll see when it finally lands. Fingers crossed that we do get it for a good price. So it's kind of coming in, at least for me, at a pretty affordable rate. This specific bottle did, because I didn't have to pay VAT, I didn't have to pay shipping. This was actually a pretty damn good deal at the end of the day. Now, if I was paying $70 a bottle, that would put this right in line with a number of the other heavily peated options out there. Port Charlotte 10, Ardbeg 10, even starting to get close to the like Lafroig 10 cast strength price and everything like that. So it is entering the arena with some pretty heavy competition. But I do try to look at things for what they are or what the producer intended them to be, and not try to necessarily compare it one to one with something that it's more of an apples to oranges situation. This is kind of a unique thing. This is a curious choice, really, if you ask me. When these young distilleries are doing this core range bottling that, by its very nature, is likely going to mature and probably trend older as time goes on. Just because if someone does have maybe a little bit of a unfavorable experience with a young whiskey early on, that they may still be hesitant to buy that bottle that has the exact same name on it, even maybe a few years down the road. So I do wonder how that works. But at the end of the day, I was excited to get this, but it was more so from a curiosity perspective to see what was coming out of Ardnahoe, to get to taste that, this new worm tub equipped Isla distillery. But yeah, at least for the time being, this is the entry into that kind of $70 or $80 heavily peated Isla range. And that's where it's going to stay most likely. So we do need to kind of take a look at it and see how it compares. Before we get into the tasting notes, I will kind of come back to what I mentioned earlier, and that is pretty much any review that I have seen of this bottle. Being that this has been out since September in the UK, at least, I believe. There are a lot of reviews for this out there, and almost every single one is comparing it to the 5-year-old inaugural release. And almost everyone that I have seen has stated that this is not as good as that 5-year-old inaugural release, and that has resulted, at least for many of those reviews, or for those reviewers, they have been met with some degree of disappointment. I have tasted the inaugural release again, and I don't really recall it specifically. I liked it. It placed second in my blind next to a 22-year-old Bowmore. It did beat out the 17-year-old Port Escaig that night, and then Ardbeg Ardcore came in a pretty distant last. I do kind of remember that. But so I did enjoy this. It beat out a 17-year-old whiskey, and only lost out to a pretty well-aged Bowmore, a very expensive bottle of Bowmore, I might add. But that one certainly held its own. I have not tasted it since. I do still have the sample, but I wanted to come at this with a fresh perspective, as I mentioned. So let's talk about the bottle actually really quick. Just a few other stats about this. This is non-age stated. It is coming in at 50% ABV, so they're going kind of the Port Charlotte route and giving us a little bit of extra punch there. This is a combination of ex-bourbon and ex-Oloroso sherry casks. The Malt Whiskey Yearbook did say that it was the inaugural release had about 25% Oloroso cask, and this one had less than that, or slightly less than that. I don't find this to be a particularly sherry-influenced whiskey. To my palate, it's pretty light. I think it does add maybe a little bit of layers. I tend to find like a good dose of sherry does help younger whiskeys, particularly ones that are unpeated in particular, to really kind of help hide some of the grain notes that can kind of come out, that kind of shiny, at times metallic or overly mineralic grain, which can be good. Like Ardnamarkin does a really good job with it. But generally speaking, I do find that either peat or some noticeable cask influences is very helpful for young whiskey. Yeah, I don't think there's too much else to say about it. Let's get into the nosing and tasting notes. There are some notes on the bottle. I will read those to you here. We got sea spray, Isla peat, and dark chocolate on the nose, menthol, fresh fruits, and bonfire notes on the palate. Lead into a smoky, zesty finish. And that's actually the first time I've read those, believe it or not, because I think those are pretty accurate. Those are pretty spot on with my experience. But let's go through it, and we'll give this thing a score. We'll talk about value a little bit, and yeah, we'll talk about comparing whiskeys and a very brief intro into my a train of thought that I've had for a long time and that I want to talk about more in the future. But That would be for after the scoring and value, so if you want to stick around for that, feel free. But let's nose it. Here we go. So the first thing that is just obvious is that this is an Islay whiskey. There are some other distilleries, Letcheck from Tobermory, for example, that can kind of emulate it, but this is Islay P all day long. There's almost no mistaking it. So this is going to fit right in, right? This isn't off the beaten path in terms of just the overall style of whiskey. If you like Islay Peat, this will probably be at least of interest to you. If you don't, there you go. The peat note is certainly the dominant quality. I think Ardnahoe does the 40 ppm barley, what they peat the barley to, which is pretty standard, right? They can go, there's some distilleries that kind of go up to the 50, 55, but 40 is a pretty common note. And being young without a ton of cask influence, by the way, on the nose, it's pretty apparent. The peat is very sea salty, sea spray, as they say. This is a coastal Islay. I do occasionally get a whiff of like a little Band-Aid, some barrel char. But yeah, this is Campfire by the Beach, which I think the bottle said sea spray and yeah, bonfire notes. It's extremely indicative of that. It's a fairly clean, smoky peatiness. I don't get any industrial, just a touch again of some Band-Aid here and there, but certainly not like a Lefroy level. Kind of behind it, there is a little bit of bright freshness, right? You're kind of talking kind of that lemon apple, touch of honey. Pretty common notes to find in kind of bourbon cask forward Islay whiskeys, young Islay whiskeys. There's nothing really surprising here. It's not harsh at 50% 50% ABV. It's not singeing the nose hairs or anything like that. It's not coming off grainy or metallic. But it's certainly aromatic. It's setting you up for a relatively punchy palate as well, which is what you get, but not necessarily hot either. Yeah, I like it. It's good. It's pretty classic. I don't think there's anything about it that really grabs me as being distinct about, just completely setting it apart from other distilleries, which is probably hard to do. Like I said, there were quite a few names, well-known names associated with other Islay distilleries that kind of had a little bit of say in the initial direction of this. So they were definitely, it certainly seemed like they were aiming to create something that was going to fit in with the tradition of peated Islay Scotch whiskey, and it's certainly presenting itself that way. I don't love it at this point. It's not something that really kind of grabs me and pulls me in. It's kind of like, yeah, okay, this is that fairly classic Islay whiskey. It kind of sits maybe in the middle of that Ardbeg ashy and not really getting too much like Port Charlotte bacony, but a little bit of, there's not really black pepper. Sometimes I get that pretty heavily on Port Charlottes as well, but this is more kind of like Lagavulin, Ardbeg with splash of Lefroy in there. Like it's kind of hard to say, right? Everybody kind of interprets them, those other distilleries slightly differently. But I did compare this to an Ardbeg 10 at some point, and that was kind of the direction I was leaning in as to a good comparison for this. But this is punchier, a little bit more coastal, let's say. But yeah, solid nose. very good. I can't really pick out any flaws with it outside of just the peat is the dominant note. It's kind of hard to read some of the other things that are happening. They kind of come off just as maybe a little standard for an Islay Scotch. But let's taste it on the palate. If today's like my previous experiences, this is definitely not a shy one, and it's bringing quite a lot of flavor and sensations on the palate. So cheers, everyone. So the big thing here on the palate is it's salty. There is a pretty salty bite. The crescendo of flavor, it's salty. I like that, but it is also just so distinct, and it almost kind of, the first sip is always kind of a shock. The front of the palate was pretty creamy. It's kind of got, that's kind of where the brine kind of comes out. It's almost like it's not quite this kind of seafood, like a fresh oyster, but kind of like, if you get a fresh oyster, that it's kind of always got some of the seawater in it, right? And definitely kind of has some of that and some honey. And then the finish is where things really kind of get interesting. That's where it really starts to dry out, and it's reminiscent to me of either, especially the other night, it was very distinctly like post smoking a cigar. I don't smoke a lot of cigars, but and I assume this is probably kind of a product of not smoking them very often, but you smoke a cigar and it just, you can taste it for possibly the rest of the day. It just kind of hangs there. This is a very clingy whiskey. It coats your mouth. It's very heavy, as I mentioned, on the sensations. In the front, it's a little creamy, a little oily. Then you get the big kind of salty bite, and then it like flattens out is probably the wrong word, but it just starts drying out your mouth, similar to kind of after you smoke a cigar. It has a very similar sensation for me. Not as much tobacco today. I think I'm picking out a little bit more chocolate today. There is kind of very light, kind of chocolate covered nuts on the back end of the finish. But you get some more of that barrel char, and again, the drying sensation is very distinct. One more sip. Cheers. The bottle said fresh fruits. Yeah, there's some fruit in here, but it's very kind of just, it's very undistinct to me, right? It's kind of apples, maybe some apple skins. Just something that you can taste in a lot of Scotch whiskey in particular. It said menthol on the bottle. I have gotten mint, like more of a mintiness on the very, very back of the finish. Like sometimes I'll be sitting there, maybe even a couple minutes after I've taken the sip, and I'll just get a kind of a light mintiness kind of coming up from the back of my throat, sort of thing. So I do get that occasionally. It's nice. I don't like mint in my whiskey too much. I'm not a big mint fan to begin with. Like some American ryes can be very minty, and those are not the type of ryes that I tend to like. When it's subtle and it's kind of adding something, in this case, I think it's fine. It kind of comes on as a surprise at the end, at least for me. So it doesn't bother me at all. If anything, it's pleasant. So overall, it fits. Like I was saying, on the nose, it's kind of straightforward. I think it's a little bit more impactful on the palate. Again, the salty bite, at least at this point, very early on in the bottle, tends to be the star of the show, and then kind of followed up with this kind of cigar-like drying sensation that hangs around for a good long while. I've gotten a little bit of tobacco, I've gotten chocolate, and that mint kind of in varying quantities depending on which day it was that I was tasting this. But it's good. It's tasty. It's, again, maybe lacking. I need to taste more of it to know whether that kind of salty cigar sort of vibe is its thing. Is that what Ardnahoe is going to be doing? Is that really just a product of this release? Is it a product of its youth? Don't know, because this is really the only example that I have so far without tasting the inaugural release, which again I do have a quick sample, but I'm not going to bias this review for it, or bias this review with it. So in terms of a score, this was pretty easy for me to score, actually. I was pretty confident with a 6 out of 10, above average on this. I still prefer a little bit of age. That 10-year Isla point is, maybe it's just what I'm used to at this point. But it just kind of gives it allows some of the other flavors to integrate with that smokiness. This is a very kind of peat forward whiskey, both on the nose and in the palate, generally speaking. I prefer when some of those kind of fruitier notes, or that chocolate covered nuts, which I'm sure is probably at least partially influenced by that small amount of Oloroso that was included in the vatting here. I like it when those have a little bit more room to shine, and that seems to come with at least a little bit of age, considering that this is probably 3, 4, 5-year-old whiskey, probably not anything much older than that, given that it came out in 2024. I know they were founded in 2017. Does it drink like 5 years old? I don't really think so. I think this is a good one. It's punchy. I think that's just the big thing. If you are looking for an elegant, nuanced dram for the evening, this might not be it. But this is a good wake-up dram. It certainly isn't sleepwalking. So 6 out of 10 for me is above average. That is a good score. A lot of those kind of 10, 12-year-old introductory whiskeys, if you've been following my channel, tend to land at a 7. So I would probably rather have those. They're a little bit more my speed. But this is a solid entry in, from a new distillery in that kind of that truly young whiskey realm. So even when I bought this, I was like, if this lands at a 6, like, it's a success for me. Should you run out and buy one? It's not a terribly priced. It's a pretty solid value when you compare it to other new distilleries and what they're releasing. As I mentioned, I think Ardnahoe Markin's AD series has been running at about $60 here in the US for quite a while. And obviously that is probably area dependent, but $60 is probably about the cheapest you're going to find it. This almost certainly won't land at that price. You are getting a few extra points of ABV from Ardnahoe, so you consider that. The AD is like half, 50% peated, 50% unpeated. Obviously peated whiskey probably have a little bit of extra cost added to it, the whole thing. So value is solid, I think. From a new distillery, I don't think you can really ask for too much more. Otherwise, you're really dipping into budget land, and then you start worrying whether the distillery is going to be able to even buy new barrels and that sort of thing. So hopefully when it lands here in the States, it's not too crazy. I do fear sometimes there's a premium on Isla whiskeys in the US, particularly in some areas. When I lived in Colorado, the prices there were just crazy for like Ardbegs and whatnot, even just their standard releases outside of the 10. Anyways, 6 out of 10 above average, a solid value. If you do get this, like, if you have the choice, if you have the option of drinking this and the inaugural release first, which one should you drink first? Probably this one. And that's from other people's experience and feedback. Use this as your barometer and treat, I think, probably the good thing is the best thing to do is to treat that inaugural release like a special release, like they were trying to put out something truly special, where this is something that they can more consistently produce, given the casks that were used, whether because not every Oloroso cask is created equal, right? There's good Oloroso casks, there's solid Oloroso casks, and then there's terrible ones. And maybe this was more solid than and the inaugural release was the best ones that they had. Who knows? I certainly don't. Maybe someone does. But yeah, it is kind of, it's unfortunate for Ardnahoe, because I think this is a good whiskey. I think from any other distillery would be happy if this was their first offering out into the world. I'm sure there's probably people out there that would like this much more than I do because, yeah, this isn't necessarily my style. But if everyone's comparing it to the inaugural and saying, this is disappointing because it's not that good, I don't know. Those are two different whiskeys made for two different occasions. And I don't know if I would have expected, at least for my personal preference, much more than this. But yeah, I can see if the inaugural really was that good and setting that bar really high, that can put a distillery in a tough. It's such an unfortunate thing, right? Because they do the best they can to release that first impression of their distillery, the best that they can possibly do with the whiskey that they have in barrels, and then when they follow that up with something like, "Hey, we can put this out in perpetuity," people look at it like, "Well, it's not as good as the special one." I It's easy for me to not go there because I didn't own a bottle of that. So it's just kind of in the principles that I have are like, you should probably look at them as two separate things that hopefully maybe can get there. Maybe at some point, the average age of the whiskey that they have in barrels that can get up to that 5-year point, or the youngest whiskey will get up to 5-year point, and they can add a little bit more Oloroso casks to kind of round things out. And maybe they just need to work up to that a bit. But I think this is a worthy entry. It's not going to change. It hasn't changed my outlook completely on kind of that ultra young category of new distillery whiskey, but I am still always excited to try it and to find out. This is definitely one that I'm going to enjoy drinking, unlike the Isle of Raasay that I reviewed earlier on the channel. That a strange batch, don't know anything about it, don't know what's in it. You can watch that review if you want. I didn't like it, and it's unfortunately it kind of makes you hesitate to try other Isle of Raasays, even when other people are saying like, hey, they actually are making pretty good product. Anyways, I'm yapping again, so I'm gonna wrap this up. Yeah, let me know what you think of Ardnahoe. Have you gotten to try the Infinite Loch, and are you comparing it directly with the inaugural release, the 5-year-old? Can you separate those two and what they are, or is this just like, no, you set the bar here and you should you should continue to hit that? Again, I don't have an opinion one way or the other in particular, but or were you able to come at this one from a completely fresh perspective, and where do you rate it in kind of the 55-pound, $70 to $80 kind of Isla range that we have access to? That is pretty ubiquitous worldwide, as they tend to be fairly available. So yeah, let me know down in the comments if you made it this far in the video. I hope you didn't hate it, and you can hit the like button, and if you're new, hit the sub button. We will probably be talking about the Ardnahoe Mark in 10. My plans for this year have been kind of derailed because so many the new whiskeys that were coming out kind of in the fall in the UK are hitting the States now. So we've got a couple other interesting things that I'm looking forward to talking about, but one at a time. Thanks again for tuning in. I do really appreciate it. Until next week or next time, cheers.